Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hi, this is Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Most people are probably familiar with Buzzsprout as a podcast hosting platform, but Buzzsprout actually produces their own podcast as well. And that's why I have Alban Brooke on the show. Alban is the head of marketing at Buzzsprout, and he's the host of their podcast. In this episode, Alban and I talk about how podcasts are different from other marketing channels and determine when it's the right time for a company to invest in podcasting. I was actually listening to an interview that you did on another podcast just to get a sense of your background. And it's a pretty interesting background. I learned that you were an English major, right? That's what your degree was in out of school. You then were a teacher originally, taught over in Haiti, I believe. And then you said, oh, this probably isn't quite for me. I'm going to go to law school, practice law for a little bit. And then here we are where as head of marketing at Buzzsprout, this is actually, it looked to be your longest tenure at a position. So what about this combination of podcasting and technology? What about that do you enjoy the most?
Yeah, it's kind of been this path through different types of work. One of the things I've definitely realized is different jobs have just totally different lifestyles, and we often don't appreciate how different work will feel. Like, it's not just the same job, slightly different. It's a totally different life based on what career path you pick. Yeah. So teaching school, that was definitely like lots of purpose, but also easy to burn out because there's just incredible need. And there's definitely not any money in teaching overseas. Then the practice of law, which I worked as a paralegal, then went to law school, then practiced. And that whole period, I think only was maybe 6 years. And that was definitely there's the prospect of money. And at the very end, there was money, but all of what you really get is, this is a profession that wants all of your time. Yeah. And it was to do a lot of work that I realized I just was never going to love. It's a lot of routine, doing the same type of work day in, day out, and working long hours. So that was a kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, which was, really long hours, not a lot of purpose, but the prospect of money was there. And when I was practicing law and realizing I, hated it and wanted to do something different, one of my roommates was a programmer. I had 3 roommates, and one was doing sales, one was programming, one was a groundskeeper for our college. And between those 3 jobs and mine, I realized like there wasn't a huge correlation between how much you enjoyed your job, how hard you worked, and how much money you made and how much purpose you had. Like, those were not correlated in any way. You basically could try to find certain jobs that had all or none of those.
Right.
And that was 2014, which is when I believe it's right when Apple Podcasts becomes a default app on the iPhone, and Serial comes out right at the end of the year. Mm-hmm. And one of my good friends was working at Buzzsprout, and I was like, hey, if you can ever get me an interview there, I would love to come work in tech. And since then, I took that job. That's been 6.5 years ago. So yeah, it's been my longest tenure, and it's definitely suited me much better than the legal profession ever did.
Very nice. Yeah. And how did you get some of that early exposure just to marketing principles in general? Because it looked like you stepped right into the role as head of marketing, right? So you're kind of thrown into the fire, so to speak, right away, it seems.
Yeah, so we're a really small company. Our parent company only had a handful of employees. I joined like the development team really, and my first thing was just to help take all the support requests off the senior engineer and the senior designer. And so it was basically in the beginning just a support role.
Mm-hmm.
And there was always this, and the goal is marketing eventually. We had some legal issues, so I would help with legal stuff, but primarily in the beginning, it was just support. And all the marketing was 100% self-taught. So we didn't have any marketing expertise in-house. And we were just kind of trial by fire, trying to figure it out. So, starting to read books, read blog posts, watch YouTube videos, take courses, and try to implement ideas as quickly as I could between support requests. And once we got enough traction that we had so many people writing into support that it was more than a full-time job, then we were able to hire somebody to take the support piece. And then I was able to move into marketing full-time.
Yeah, but that actually seems like an advantage though, because I feel like a lot of marketers, when they do step into that role, they don't get the opportunity to be on the front line, so to speak, and get a really good understanding of what customers are looking for, what problems they're having. So that's probably a good thing that you had that exposure to all of those issues up front and said, hey, all right, how can we then speak to the same audience on the marketing side to now grow the business, right?
One thing I love to say is that everybody wants to do this cool strategy work. Everybody wants to be the big idea behind all of the work. And the only way that you can really do that is by executing at the lowest levels for quite a while, so that you understand, like, here's the actual terrain, here's what people are actually asking, here are the actual problems. And then, okay, can I now write the blog posts and create the podcast and do the videos and figure out what our ad strategy is going to be? And then eventually you kind of continue to step up into higher and higher strategy stuff, even though everybody kind of likes to imagine that if they were brought in as the CEO of GE or something, that you'd be able to like implement a great plan day one.
Right.
You really need to start at the ground floor. So I know one of the things we really pride ourselves at Buzzsprout is we try to get everybody, regardless of jobs, into support at some point. We try to get them exposure to our Facebook group where they're interacting with customers. Everybody goes to podcast conferences. Really about once a year, everybody goes to one. And the whole goal there is, if your work is divorced from the people who are actually using it, then you're not going to have the same drive to do a great job. And it's really been valuable for us just having that connection with our customers. I think it happened just because we were small in the beginning, and now it's definitely part of the culture.
Yeah, I love that. It's a good segue to understanding a little bit more about how Buzzsprout uses podcasting as a company. So, as we were going back and forth on Twitter, one of the things that you mentioned in some of the notes we shared was how you were passionate about, and let me get this right, the notion of how podcasting is different than other marketing channels. So tell me, from your experience, what is so different about podcasting?
One of the misconceptions I hear all the time is that podcasting is a way to get really wide volume. You get a lot of exposure, a lot of impressions, and you're going to be just as big as Joe Rogan and This American Life and Serial. And then people can't help but find your business because of that. And that's actually like TikTok and social media. They're on like one end of the spectrum, which is just massive exposure, and almost all the way on the other end, right next to like long form blog posts, are podcasts. And they're so far away. And so I think it's important to appreciate how podcasts are different so that we can then figure out where they fit into your marketing strategy. So the main difference comes from the fact that podcasts don't have an algorithm. Podcasts don't go viral. They of their own accord on something on YouTube. If a lot of people watch it and they click like and they subscribe, YouTube starts recommending it even more. And then those people like it and they recommend it even more. And no matter how small the creator is, they can go viral off a video or two if they get lucky. Same with somebody tweeting something on Twitter. As soon as it starts getting picked up, people are retweeting it. People think it's funny. Well, then it starts taking on a life of its own and it grows really fast. And a lot of the social media platforms have this baked in. We even have this with Google search, where if a page does a good job of answering people's questions, just basic SEO, Google search recommending it more right at the top of the search terms.
Yeah.
So we've got that in a lot of other places where it becomes kind of a winner take all approach, where you can start out small and you're unlikely to get a lot of exposure. But if you do, then you get a ton over time. Where in podcasting, it's kind of the opposite. If you listen to my podcast, you may not recommend it to a bunch of people. Or if you do, you're recommending it to one or two people. You're not just clicking a button and all of a sudden it's showing up in front of 7,000 more people.
Right.
And so we have a much less of a chance to go viral. So what that means is that in podcasting, almost everyone who listens to you has a reason to be there. There probably were a personal recommendation. They have a much more of a vested interest in the podcast than if somebody was just on YouTube and they're kind of bored for the afternoon, so they're watching video after video. Podcasting is much more deliberate. And one way I said this in a talk I gave at PodFest was, in podcasting, we really don't have casual fans. I actually asked podcasters to raise their hand, and like the whole room went up when I said, how many of you have pulled out someone's phone, clicked on the purple app and said, this is Apple Podcast, go ahead and subscribe to my show. Here's how you do it. And almost everyone says they have done it, because we are not doing what happens everywhere else on the web, which is imagining people find us on their own. We actually do the work. And so our audience size is so much smaller than the audience size for like a big Facebook page or something. But what we get out of that on the other end is way, way more investment and intimacy with our podcast listeners. The depth of the relationship you're creating with a podcast listener is so much greater than what you're getting from somebody who's watching even all of your TikTok videos or multiple of your YouTube videos. All of podcast listeners, they're just way more connected to you. So, that kind of takes me back to, well, where does this fit into my marketing strategy?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's going to fit into my marketing strategy when it makes sense for me to create a very deep connection with a few set of people rather than a very light connection with any number of millions of people. And so there's times for both. Both of those have their place in marketing, but podcasting needs to be when you really know who these people are and you want to connect deeply with them.
And Alban, when does it make sense, at least from your perspective, to make the investment in that podcast?
So if you're trying, we talk about it, there's a lot of flaws in this metaphor, but the marketing funnel. And if your whole goal is nobody's even aware of us, nobody knows about us, you're looking at top of funnel, you need to be getting more exposure than podcasting probably is going to provide. If what you're trying to do is maybe a bit deeper down the funnel, which is maybe you're selling a product that is really expensive or a product that really requires a long sales cycle and people need to trust you, or you're in a field where making a couple of the right connections is key to you actually succeeding. When a few specific people make all the difference to you, then podcasting actually has a ton of opportunity. If you're in an industry where you're selling, $12 toothbrushes, well, then you need to be figuring out how to get in front of millions of people. Whereas if you're selling, something much more expensive, than podcasting works. So I'll give you an example. We had somebody on Buzzsprout who, when I talked to him, he was getting somewhere about 150 plays per episode.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, this is the best marketing I have ever done. And I was like, how is this the best marketing you've ever done? You're doing 150 plays per episode. It was, well, what he does is he sets up call centers for big companies. So if a company wants to have a call center, not outsource it, instead have all this in-house so that people can call in and answer questions, he helps them set it up. And so what he does is he only has a handful of clients and projects a year. And each of them are really big ticket items where he's coming in as a consultant.
Right.
And he said, what happened was, because he started this podcast, he became recognized as an industry leader started getting paid speaking gigs at industry events. Everyone starts realizing like, oh, that's the guy. And then clients that he's chasing for years are now coming to him because they're going, oh, if we're going to go with anyone, it's going to be the person who's kind of the expert in this area. And what happens is when you're kind of doing that content marketing where you're giving away the secret sauce over and over, what ends up happening is people always think we're going to start this call center, we're going to do it ourselves, and we're going to do a great job. So the first thing they do is they search online and they start finding his podcast, and he's answering all the questions they have. And they go through the podcast for maybe a month and they are running into all these snags. And then they realize, man, this is so much more difficult than we thought. Who could we hire? Well, how about the guy that has built up this incredible trust and helped us so much for months? Then they reach out immediately.
Yeah. And I think that's something that people don't realize is when you do share so much, your audience and just the folks in your environment, I think they feel that there's still more that you're not sharing, right? So it's like if you're sharing all this and you have all this knowledge, this person, this industry leader or thought leader, they still probably know things that I don't even know yet, or I'm not even thinking about yet. So there's a deeper level of just connection there, like you're talking about, where there's more to this person than what is on the podcast. They have so much experience. What they're sharing is so rich that they're going to be able to help me when I am running into this issue.
People, they think that there's a lack of customers in the world when really there's a lack of trust in the world. And if you're trying to connect with somebody, don't be afraid that, oh, I'm going to give away this information and all of a sudden I'm going to lose all potential customers. They won't buy the course. They'll just read the blog post and then they're good. Or they won't hire me as a consultant. They'll just take the course or whatever it may be. Instead, there's actually a lack of trust. And so as soon as you have built the trust with people, maybe by giving away free blog posts or a podcast or video content, then they're going to run into questions for things that you never thought to teach them anyway. And when they think, yeah, it really would be nice to have some hand holding. Well, now they're already a pre-qualified lead, someone who desperately wants you in particular to be the person to help them. And then you hop on the phone with them and, now you've got a client for life versus the other way, which is you seeking them out, trying to prove to them that you're actually the person they should hire. And they're already a little bit guarded because they've been sold things so many times and there's no trust. So now you have to do all the hard work. It's way more conducive with my personality. It's to give away a little too much and then not have to do that hard sell, instead have customers come to you.
I feel you there. Justin, my business partner and I, that's really our approach. Is sometimes we even overshare, but it's like if someone then reaches out to us after everything that we've put out there and how we've outlined our approach and how we develop shows, then they know a lot about us. They know about our approach. And there's that sense of, comfort in what we're going to talk about. And so it makes those conversations a lot easier, like you said, and that helps with our personalities too. So that's something people don't really talk about with podcasting, how it does break down some of those barriers without you even knowing it, because people are listening to your show, they're consuming your content, and you don't even know who they are on the other side until they reach out. And then it's like, oh, this person has listened to several episodes. They have a deeper understanding of our mindset and how we approach things. And that just helps with the sales cycle so much more.
Yeah, I'll give you another anecdote. We put out a lot of the same content in multiple formats. So years ago, I wrote a blog post on how to start a podcast that we rewrite every year. And then we did a video series. And then we did a podcast series on how to start a podcast. And we did a course. And it's all pretty much the same material, but packaged for each individual medium. And whenever I go to conferences, now people will come up and every once in a while people will go, oh, you're Alban, you're the person who taught me how to podcast. And I don't know. I mean, I know why. In the beginning, I was a little surprised. I always ask how did you find us? How did you learn? And they go, oh, I listened to your podcast.
Yeah.
And I go, well, man, we recorded that podcast over a 2-week period years ago. And we edited it, we produced, we put it out there. And now it does have, I think, hundreds of thousands of downloads. But it's remarkable to me that that is still really small in comparison to how many people watched our videos or read our blog posts. And yet those are the people who always show up and talk to me.
Right.
And I believe it's really because they didn't just watch 3 minutes of me being silly on a YouTube video or read a quarter of a blog post that I wrote. They connected to my voice. They listened to it for, I think, something like 25 minutes for 8 episodes. So we're almost at 4 hours of content.
Yeah.
And that is much more conducive to building a relationship with someone and feeling that level of intimacy. And if you're trying to sell someone on something, well, the best thing you could do is build a relationship with them first, and then they trust you. And then you don't have to haggle over price or prove that you're better than a competitor. You're just the default. They go, oh, I don't have to learn about everything. I already used all of your content, and now I want to work with you long term.
That's right. Yeah. And Alban, let's talk about some of Buzzsprout's podcasts. I know Buzzcast is in place, right? And that features interviews. And you also have some other shows that you mentioned. And I know Buzzcast has gone through some evolution as well. And I think right now, I looked up the description as far as how you all described it. You define it as a roundtable podcast about podcasting. But tell me, as the head of marketing, how you structure your podcast, and how are they targeted towards different audiences?
Sure. So we have 3 podcasts. One's called How to Start a Podcast, which is just absolute top of the funnel. If somebody wants to learn, maybe they'll stumble across that podcast and learn how to do it. Then we have one called Podcasting Q&A, which is focused on answering specific podcast questions. So it's all listener questions, and then we answer them in under 5 minutes. And then the third is Buzzcast, which is that roundtable discussion of the podcasting industry. Each of those is targeting a different audience. So How to Start a Podcast are probably people who don't even know what Buzzsprout is yet. And if they do, it's a very early introduction to Buzzsprout. And so we put it into our drip emails. We share it online so that people can just listen and get started with podcasting right away. Then Podcasting Q&A, there are a few thousand people who listen to every episode, but the focus there is we're really trying to cover every podcasting question so that if people are searching for an answer, that they can find that podcast and be introduced to Buzzsprout. And then they can go through that podcast feed and say, wow, there's 200 other episodes here, and all of them are valuable. And they could, or at least a handful are valuable to them in that moment, and they can flip through. So that's much more of like a self-serve option.
Yeah. It's almost like an audio knowledge base, is what it seemed like to me, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. It's just that we want to, meet people where they are. If they're having an issue picking podcast music for their podcast, well, we want to make sure we have at least 1 or 2 episodes on that so that they can dip in, listen for 5 minutes, feel empowered to go and add this to their podcast, and maybe come back. Again, that's not targeted only to Buzzsprout customers. We try to make all the content agnostic, because if your podcast is hosted on Libsyn or Anchor or somewhere else, we want to make sure that we're still interested in developing a relationship with you in case, your other host doesn't work out, or we live in a world of abundance. We don't have to make sure that every single person is a customer before we're willing to give away anything. So it's just a good way to, cast a wide net and help anyone that may need a little bit of help in a particular area. Yeah. And then Buzzcast is all the way, like I said, that the metaphor of a funnel is kind of broken, but it's really at the very bottom. It's for people who are already customers, people who have been maybe using Buzzsprout for a few months and want to just kind of keep abreast of like what's happening in the podcasting space, what kind of things are should I be thinking about as my podcast grows, what new tools are coming out. They just want to be informed about the podcasting area. And it's with a heavy dose of Buzzsprout focused content. So we talk about the industry, but then we talk about most of the releases we have from Buzzsprout, how we think about the product. I think for episode 50, we might do kind of the origin story of Buzzsprout. At one point, we had a big DDoS attack against Buzzsprout. And when that happened and the site was down for at least a day, we did a whole episode about what that was like and explaining exactly what happened. And so it's our way to deepen our relationship with our existing customers, because in most businesses, definitely in the podcasting space, and also this applies to podcasting itself, most of your marketing is still word of mouth. Your marketing focus should be on enabling word of mouth advertising. And so you want your best customers to be able to talk about your industry and talk about your product and talk about you to anybody who's interested, so that you can kind of spin up this flywheel of new people coming in. Now they're successful. Your support team helps them. Then they go out and they recommend you to new potential customers. You make them successful, and you continue this flywheel spinning up over and over time. Buzzcast is that. You're already a customer. Now we're going to help you learn even more about this industry you're in, so that if any of your friends want to start a podcast, or your business partner or whatever it may be, that they reach out to you, and Buzzsprout can be part of that conversation.
Alban, we talked earlier before we got started about how I listened to the Buzzcast initial trailer, and it sounded like the original intention was to have one feed, right, with several different types of shows sprinkled in. But it sounds like you've gone the opposite way, and you said, hey, we're going to create different shows for different types of audiences. So can you talk about that evolution and how you all landed on this approach?
I definitely did not remember that until you brought that up, that Buzzcast originally was this like super feed. And I think we had a handful of different shows in there. We had one called 5-Minute Mondays, which nobody has any idea what that means because the name was terrible. It was, yes,
that was one of them. Yeah.
What the format was, that it was on Monday and they were 5 minutes long. But eventually it was like, this is a terrible name. We're rebranding it Podcasting Q&A, because it was where we answered people's questions in 5 minutes or less. The 5 minutes was not important. The podcasting answers was the important part.
There you go.
The second was a podcast we called Podcasting in Real Life, which is on hiatus. And Podcasting in Real Life was interviews with podcasters, talking to them about their podcasting journey. And those were often with podcasters who were not big name podcasters. It was people who probably had a full-time job, and this was a passion project or something on the side. And we were just connecting with podcasters, learning their stories and sharing it with the world. Then I believe we had a show, and now I don't know what we originally called it, but it's what Buzzcast is now. And that is the roundtable discussion of the podcasting industry. And so I think we split those other two shows out of that feed, and then we brought, we really still liked the Buzzcast name. And so we just kept that feed and said, now this is a roundtable discussion from a few of the people at Buzzsprout.
Yeah. And what drives that decision? Because we have customers that are thinking about, creating a separate show perhaps that is more targeted or is with maybe their customers or even internal. So how do you make that decision as to when to create a separate show with some separate branding, a tighter premise? Like, what's that decision process like?
It all comes back to who the audience is. If, that how to start a podcast, if a show that we made, the audience for that show is people who really don't know much about podcasting yet, but they want to, and they want to learn. So that's our introduction to podcasting. And then if you want to go deeper, then we have a different show because it's a different audience. So that's podcasting Q&A. And then if you want to be an industry insider and you want to know exactly what Buzzsprout is adding to the product so that you're already a customer, that you get access to all of that and you can utilize it to the your best extent, well, then Buzzcast is a good show for you. And as we realized more and more, these aren't really the same audience. It wasn't really fair to just put all of that in one feed and basically ask people to delete half of the episodes. And I would say it's always a method of experimentation because you really don't know the answers to all of this when you start. When we started, we thought that podcasting in real life show was going to be amazing and everyone was going to love it and it was going to get really big. And it never really was getting downloads. We could see on the same feed, podcasting, the 5-minute Mondays, those actual Q&A episodes, those were getting way more downloads than the much more heavily produced conversations that we were having with podcasters. And so it was really nice. I mean, it was a bit of a bummer, but it was nice to be able to say all this hard work that we're putting into this, we don't have to do it anymore because not a lot of people are listening to it. We can go ahead and put that one on hiatus until we have a better way of tackling this problem. And we can double down on this podcasting Q&A concept. And so when we split it out, we could actually give it a smarter name. So if they have the same audience, consider launching them together. If you realize they have a different audience, well, then you can split them out and do something different with them.
Sorry, go ahead, Al.
I think it just always goes back to the whole goal of content marketing is we are doing our very best to meet people where they are, to give them value. And in doing that, we are building trust. And so you don't want to make it difficult for people to engage with your content the way they want to. And it doesn't matter if it hurts your numbers because of course it would be better for our numbers if we merged all those feeds and made everybody wade through it. We'd get more downloads, but they'd be more downloads that would be deleting the episodes. They aren't actually caring to listen. And so I'd much rather have a smaller listener base, but then that listener base actually feel connected to the content. And if you ever worried that maybe people would be interested in both shows, well, that's when cross promos make great sense. You drop an episode from one podcast on the other and maybe do a little intro and conversation about it so that people can decide if they want to engage with the other format type.
Yeah, that's a good point. And people don't do that often enough where even with your podcast guest appearances, you can put those through your feed too. Like if you have, as a host, have appeared elsewhere, you can drop that into your feed. But what like you're mentioning is you need to set some context. So maybe you do a custom intro to set the stage for your audience and explain why it makes sense for this to be tied into the standard feed. And they can make that decision as to whether it's right for them or not. So I think that's a good point. And this goes into something you mentioned a second ago, which was about experimenting with different things. And it sounds like Buzzsprout has done that. You've had some experiments with shows that have not gone as expected, and you decided to cut bait, right? And move into pivot, go down another path. Why is it important, do you think, when you do have a show to experiment with different things?
Well, that's very much central to our entire culture. And that's probably because our culture was developed by a bunch of developers and designers who know better than anyone. You have no clue what you're building. You don't know. You have an idea and you could spend your entire, budget of time planning and thinking through and anticipating and stressing and getting all your contingency plans ready. And then you build something and then immediately your customers tell you, oh, yeah, that's fine. But that's not really what I was thinking about. We were actually asking about this. And you're defeated. Instead, what's much better is, as a principle we adopted from a company called Basecamp, which is getting real. Just don't spend so much time up in the clouds thinking about how this show is all going to work out or how this product is going to work out. Instead, just start doing it. And in doing it, and in a conversation with your customer or your listener, you are going to learn so much more. One of the quotes I love, this is from one of the co-founders of Buzzsprout, Tom Rossi. He often says, "We never will know less than we know right now." And you really always feel like, I know everything, I'm ready to build this podcast. No, you really don't. You will never know less than you know now. And you could spend all your time thinking about it, but instead start putting things out into the world. Just record an episode with the equipment you have. You don't have to get the perfect equipment right now. Put it out there, because you don't even know what equipment to get, but maybe by putting it out there, you'll learn more, and then you'll know which equipment you'd want. Or you don't know if interviews or solo style podcasts will actually perform better for you. And by putting both of those out there, you might learn. And it's this really, we should be thinking about, and this is definitely how I think about marketing, is it's just an evolution of what you're putting out into the world. You try one thing and you hear it's going to be great from everybody else and it doesn't work for you. You maybe iterate, you try it again, it doesn't work. That's actually exciting, because now you know, okay, I don't need to do that. So for us, Facebook ads was one of those things. I put a ton of work into trying to get Facebook ads to work a handful of times for Buzzsprout, and it never worked. And it was really nice to sit down, take all of my learnings, and also say, well, I never have to go spend, waste $5,000 on Facebook again, because I tried it and it didn't work. And you can find different things that work for you. And when you find something that works, it's so incredible to then double down and then double down again and double down again. And then eventually your entire company is focusing on something that was just an experiment years ago.
What is something along those lines that surprised you, that maybe you didn't know was going to work as well as it did, but then you were able to double down?
Now, this may just seem silly because I didn't have a marketing background, so other people may hear this and just laugh at it. But when we knew blog, like it was a good idea to blog and to interact with our customers in that format, but we would write blogs that would be more of these, like, we saw BuzzFeed's doing really well, so we'd want to do like a listicle, or we'd want to do a little bit more of like a clickbaity type piece, a piece that was saying like 5 reasons why you've got to start a podcast right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I remember being in support and people were asking about podcast artwork. And so I went, well, it feels like a lot of people are confused about this. So I just sat down, I think I took 2 days, and I wrote everything you need to know about podcast artwork. And I put it out into a piece, and I put it up on the blog, and didn't really think about it again for a bit. And then eventually I go back to our Google Analytics at some point, and I'm like, this blog post on podcast artwork is getting thousands of reads every month. And no other blog post had performed pretty much at all more than, like a day or two. They'd get a little bump on social media, then they'd fade away. And what I realized was happening was SEO. Like, we'd written a really good piece of content, and Google was recommending it as the number one answer for a bunch of things like, how do I make podcast artwork? And we became the authority. And that became really clear. Okay, so we need to be creating these pieces of content that take a lot of time to invest in, that answer your question completely, and that we can use for years and years to come. So I think I wrote that first one maybe 6 years ago, and still update it every few months just to make sure that this is the best piece of content that we can create on that topic. And when we figured that out on the blog, we spent years building up hundreds of posts on the blog that we try to rank in Google. Then we were able to use that and experiment with YouTube and basically create YouTube videos for each of those pieces of content. We were able to create podcast episodes off of each of those pieces of content. And it was, by putting the hard work in on the front end and actually creating these pieces of content that be there for years, we learned so much more about how content marketing works. and we're able to kind of reap the rewards of that for years and years afterward. But in the beginning, it was just, I had an idea of how blogs would work because I saw BuzzFeed and I saw all these, competitors writing the pieces they were writing. And it was only by trying different things that I kind of accidentally fell into content marketing and search engine marketing, building off SEO.
Yeah, love that. And the data kind of points you in the right direction sometimes, right? And I wanted to talk about transitioning a little bit to workflow. So you as a host, one of the primary hosts of Buzzcast, and I know that you interviewed Pat Flynn recently. So I wanted to ask you about that because I think what's helpful for our audience is to understand your role as head of marketing and how you're involved with your own podcast. So can you tell me about how you prepped for that interview with Pat, who's really one of these podcast superheroes, really? And I know even in the episode that you had, you'd mentioned that a lot of people actually find out about Buzzsprout through Pat, right? That he introduces folks to podcasting. So how was that preparation process like for you?
So the way that I prepare for podcast interviews is mostly I'm asking someone to be on the podcast because I know something about them and I have a feel for what I think is interesting. Now that's just a guess at what the conversation will be about. You shouldn't be too rigid. I actually think in that Pat Flynn interview, I think I probably was too rigid because I had so many things that I was like, I really want to talk about this with him, and probably missed out at times on being able to follow up to interesting segments. But pretty much what I do is, this probably comes from my legal background. I just spend as much time as I can in the source documents. So the source documents for a podcast interviewee are, what other podcasts have they been on? Well, why don't I go listen to as many of them as I can? And maybe you might be lucky enough that they have 5 episodes out there and you can listen to all 5. And as you're hearing interesting things, just taking notes almost of things you would like them to say, but not really. I don't really have the questions. I'm just kind of going, that's a really interesting thing about them. And then sometimes I'm saying, and this is the question that I wish the host had asked, that they maybe missed. And I'm just kind of doing this. I put it all in a program called Roam, but I'm basically just putting in like hundreds and hundreds of notes from all those podcast interviews. Then I see if they've done any videos. I start going through their LinkedIn. I go through, any blog posts they've written, and you just start kind of following up on all these things that I've heard in the podcasts. And then the next step is I start clumping them together so that, if it's Pat, there's a big piece that I want to ask about his podcast courses and things that he's taught in the podcasting space. But another thing I wanted to share with our audience was he is a New York Times bestselling author. And one of those books was called Super Fans, which I really felt connected with a podcasting audience. So I wanted to have that conversation. And he is doing pretty well on YouTube now. So I wanted to have a conversation about YouTube versus podcasting. And so I start clumping all of those comments together. And then I start writing questions where the things I've saved earlier are the answers. So I actually interviewed Jordan Harbinger, who also his background is as an attorney.
Oh,
and when we talked, I remember saying to him, like, this is similar to how he preps for podcasts as well. And I was like, Jordan, I think what you're doing and what I'm doing is depo prep, which is the prep that a lawyer does for a deposition. And
it's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah.
And you also do this thing that when you do cross-examination in a trial, one of the rules is like, you don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. So you're always trying to draw something out of the witness that is useful for the jury to hear. And I realized I was doing that. I saw what things I wanted to hear and what things I thought were interesting to draw out. And then I was writing questions that led into those. So by doing it this way, you actually able to say things like, well, tell me about the time this happened. And they don't really understand what the question is, and they kind of give partial answer. And then you now have like 4 notes beneath it. And you say, now there was one time your fiance did something. I thought it was a really great story. And then they go, oh, you're right. Okay, so here it is. Then they jump in. You can even edit out that follow-up piece.
Right.
But because you've done the prep backwards, you are able to make sure you're not just missing, the person you're interviewing. And then the thing that I am not great at and I want to improve on is your job really is to be present in the moment. It's not to be, you don't want to look further down your outline and think, well, now I've got this next question I'm going to ask as soon as he's done rambling about this. Instead, you want to be like laser focused on what they're saying so that you can ask the follow-up question that your audience is thinking of, because your audience is not worried about the next question. The audience is listening intently going, okay, we'll follow up on that. And then if you as the host jump to your next question, it's actually maybe not apparent to you or to the person you're interviewing. It's very apparent to the listeners.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, that I struggle with that too, because I mean, there are probably 15 questions I won't even get a chance to ask you here today. And it's like, but I try to review my outline as much as possible so I have an understanding of the priorities, right? What to focus on. And I think I've never really heard it presented that way, where it's almost like a deposition, right? Or you're doing all this research and you're trying to put this puzzle together and figure out maybe the best way to construct it for your audience, which is really what it's about. And it's a challenge. And I think that's what is so fun about podcasting. There is the best thing to do is not to have a set number of questions where it's like, this is what I'm going to ask every time, because I mean, I enjoy the process of just going through and constructing an outline, what I'm going to ask, and going through the research and just really trying to understand each person individually.
There's definitely a lot of different styles to interviewing, and I think they all have a place in podcasting, and they all bring out different things. So, I mean, a couple examples, like Larry King famously did almost no prep for any of his interviews. He would get a one sheet that he'd read on the way into the interview. He probably wouldn't really know who this person was. He'd kind of ask the very basic questions. But because he kind of had to, he was laser focused and would ask good follow-ups. But he would often make mistakes where he'd ask a question that had kind of a obvious answer. He famously asked Jerry Seinfeld how he felt when Seinfeld was canceled. And Jerry's like, canceled? We quit when we were the #1 show on TV. Do you even do any prep for these? Yeah. So you've got the Larry King type. Maybe I think of Terry Gross, who does these incredible deep conversations that always bring out like a really interesting emotional story. I love her interview style. She does Fresh Air if anybody wants to listen to her podcast. You can think of maybe Joe Rogan, who seems to know a lot about his guests, but is often bouncing kind of off the wall things off them. So he's just saying like, hey, do you see that crazy video on YouTube? Do you see this? Like, oh, what do you think of that person? What do you think of this? And he's very free form, but what he brings out is the personality of the person. So, his famous interviews of like Elon Musk are really us getting to see what is Elon Musk like in a day-to-day person, because he's not just answering big questions about SpaceX.
Right.
And I don't know, there's so many other ways of approaching this. Now I'm blanking on her name. What is the woman who does Recode Decode? Kara Swisher.
Okay.
And her style is, she is unapologetic about asking the questions that she really wants to know the answers to. And a lot of interviews, like I feel like Joe Rogan would never be abrasive to his audience, the person he's interviewing.
Especially now, with
Yeah,
Spotify and
definitely
play,
no.
got to tread lightly there. Yeah.
But Kara Swisher will just ask Tim Cook, like, hey, you've got this, you're doing this thing for the App Store and you say it's for everyone's benefit, but it doesn't really look like it is. And he's like, oh, yeah, it is. Here's why. She goes, no, it's not because of this. And just kind of leaves it. And
Yeah.
she's like almost better than I think anyone at just asking tough questions and not being overly worried if people, like her after the interview, because she knows they're going to come back and ask for another interview after the fact. So
No,
there's just like, there's different types, I guess I want to say, and they're not equal, or maybe they're all equal. They're not the same. And they all are bringing out different things from the hosts. And maybe you want to approach different styles based on who you're interviewing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of that too, when we're working with customers, they ask like, what's the best way to be a host or whatever. And I think a lot of it just stems from your experiences and just practicing, going through episodes and finding out what works for you, what doesn't. Cause like my business partner, he tends to do a lot of prep calls with his guests. And I probably only do prep calls like 25% of the time because I do a lot of research and I figure out like, some of the elements that I want to uncover. And then I ask impromptu questions during the process versus trying to craft something in a prep call.
Right.
And most of the time, the only times I do a prep call is when someone is more comfortable that way, where they want to iron out things a little bit more beforehand. And that leads me to a question I want to ask as a host and a head of marketing, like what's the biggest benefit you've personally gotten out of podcasting during your tenure here at Buzzsprout?
I mean, the benefits are kind of wide ranging. So you get customers, which, turn into money, which you get a platform to share what you think about things. We have, for a long time, I feel like we were very skeptical of what Spotify still are, what Spotify's trying to do in the podcasting industry. And having the podcast allowed us to flesh those ideas out and present them. Where if I was just posting on Twitter, it would have felt like little jabs without kind of a cohesive story around it. Instead, on Buzzcast, over multiple episodes, we were able to flesh out why we were a little bit nervous about the way they're approaching the podcasting industry. But then I know this probably just sounds silly to people, but for me, a lot of it is you build a lot of really cool friendships and you get to connect with people who it may have been a little bit more difficult to connect with otherwise. So I'm definitely an extrovert. I like meeting people. I like having conversations. It's hard when you see someone online, you're like, oh, that person would probably be really interesting. And I feel like we would probably get along if we ever talked. It's weird to reach out to someone on Twitter and say, hey, would you ever want to get on an hour-long phone call and just chat?
Yeah.
People are going to look at you like, what are you talking about? But podcasting, you get to ask the people you find most interesting in the world, hey, would you come on and have a conversation? And many of those have turned into friendships. We're not talking on the phone every night, but people that now you can reach out to and bounce an idea off of them, not just asking for something, but just building a friendship with people that you think are interesting. And that's a really underrated value of podcasting. If you're trying to break into a space and you want to connect with the influencers in your space, starting a podcast is a great way to do it because, especially if you're putting in the deep work to research them ahead of time and really understand your guest, they're going to be impressed by that and you are going to build a connection. I think about one of my friends who, when I met him, he was doing construction and he ended up deciding to be a programmer. So he's totally self-taught programmer. And he's living in the Houston area and he's an African-American guy. And so he said he'd go to these meetups and he kind of always was like, I don't look like the developers. He was into bodybuilding. He was a big guy and he's like, I don't look like these guys. And they naturally just assume like, I don't know what I'm talking about, especially since he didn't have the credentials. So he started a podcast talking about his experience in tech as a Black man. And over time, people are listening to this going like understanding, his perspective, but also that he really understood his stuff. And that podcast led to him getting job offers. So he'd be applying, or people would be like, oh, I wonder if Reggie would be interested in this job. Maybe we should reach out to that guy. And boom, he's now getting job offers because he had this way for people to find him. Yeah. And it's very easy when you're trying to break into a new space. I felt it trying to learn how to teach, trying to learn how to get into law, and then trying to get into the marketing and SaaS world. Each of those, it's maybe not, I never experienced people not having something particularly against me, but it's hard to break into a space just that you aren't a part of. Starting a podcast and being able to connect with people is a great way to be invited into, kind of the larger space and connect with people.
So that's a unique story too. And what is that podcast? Is that gentleman still have the podcast running? Curious.
Yeah, it was called Coolest Nerds in the Room. And his name is Reggie Davis.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up. It's just personal curiosity there.
Yeah, it's funny. We met at Podcast Movement 2015. Yeah, because he had a hip hop podcast and have been great friends ever since. So, podcasting is a great way to connect with people. And I think it's important for us to remember part of what we really want as humans is not just money, prestige, and titles. It's also friends and connection and purpose. And podcasting can give you way more of those connections and intimate relationships and kind of these long form, thoughtful conversations that we could ever get on social media, which is just kind of this facade of friendship. And so I really believe in this space, and I'm excited for businesses and people that are kind of starting podcasts themselves.
All right. Fantastic. And Alban, what, where can people go to find out more about you and Buzzsprout?
Well, Buzzsprout is buzzsprout.com. And if you go there, you can find all of our resources. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Buzzsprout. And anything about me, probably the best place is Twitter. I'm at Alban Brooke. And if you have any questions about podcasting, my DMs are open, or you can just tweet at me and I reply to all of those, and I would love to help in any way I can.
All right. Well, Alban, thanks a bunch. I appreciate your time and spending the day with me here on Recorded Content.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it too.